1945, one state, Pennsylvania, made 20% of all the steel on Earth. Today, America can't even make its own rebar without calling another country. Steel built the United States. It built the rails that crossed the continent, the bridges that spanned its rivers, the skyscrapers that scraped its skies, and the tanks, ships, and guns that won its wars. For almost a century, American steel wasn't just a product, it was a superpower. But if you zoom out from the old black and white footage of glowing ingots and roaring furnaces to 2026, the story looks very different. The mills are quiet, the smokestacks are cold, and the country that once forged half the world's steel is now importing millions of tons a year just to keep its construction sites moving. So how did the empire of American steel fall, and how did China end up winning the metal war? Let's rewind to the moment the empire was born. In 1875, a ruthless Scottish immigrant named Andrew Carnegie opened the J. Edgar Thomson Steel Works outside Pittsburgh. He brought the Bessemer process, a new, faster way of turning molten iron into steel, to America and changed the country's fate. Suddenly, steel wasn't a luxury, it was mass-produced muscle. By the late 1880s, Carnegie Steel alone was responsible for roughly a quarter of global steel output. One company, one country, a quarter of the planet's supply. Pittsburgh became the capital of this new empire. Mills lined the rivers like fortresses. Jones and Laughlin, Homestead Works, the great U.S. steel complexes. Names that meant nothing to most people, but meant everything if you worked there. By the time World War II erupted, Pittsburgh wasn't just a city, it was a furnace for democracy. During the war, American mills ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers did 12-hour shifts, then grabbed a few hours of sleep and came back. It's estimated that around 20% of the world's steel in that era came out of Pennsylvania alone. One state was feeding a global war machine. In those decades, if you lived in steel country, it felt like the boom would never end. You could walk out of high school on a Friday and into a mill job on Monday. The pay was good, the union was strong, and the work felt like a kind of citizenship. You weren't just punching a clock, you were building the nation. U.S. Steel grew so huge that by the mid-20th century it was one of the largest corporations on Earth, and even as late as 2001, it still accounted for nearly 8% of global production. Steel wasn't just metal, it was identity. Pittsburgh was the steel city. America was the land of steel. But while the furnaces blazed in Pittsburgh, something was quietly shifting overseas. After the destruction of World War II, Japan and parts of Europe had a strange kind of advantage. They had to rebuild from scratch. Their old plants were gone, bombed, or obsolete. So when they rebuilt, they reached straight for the newest technology. Basic oxygen furnaces, continuous casting, more efficient layouts. They skipped the legacy infrastructure that American companies were clinging to. In the United States, the big steel firms stayed married to their aging open-hearth furnaces. These giants were slow, labor-intensive, and energy-hungry. They could still make steel, but not as cheaply, not as cleanly, and not as flexibly as the new competition. Engineers and economists were warning, the world is changing, the cost curves are shifting, and if you don't modernize now, you'll be crushed later. But in too many boardrooms, the answer was the same. The old ways are still working. Why spend billions to tear them out? By the 1960s and 70s, the cracks were visible. Imported steel from Japan and Europe started arriving cheaper than American steel, even after shipping it across an ocean. Basic oxygen furnaces could turn a charge into fresh steel in under an hour, while open hearths could take 8 to 10. Continuous casting let foreign mills pour steel straight into semi-finished shapes, cutting out steps and costs. Meanwhile, U.S. plants still relied on more manual, fragmented processes. The American advantage, scale, experience, brand, was bleeding out through inefficiency. Then came the knockout punch. The brutal recession of 1981 to 82. Demand collapsed. Construction slowed. Car sales fell. Suddenly, those overstaffed, under-modernized mills weren't just lagging. They were bleeding money. In Pittsburgh and across the Rust Belt, the collapse hit like a bomb. Nearly 150,000 steelworkers lost their jobs in the early 1980s alone. Unemployment in the Pittsburgh region soared to around 17% by 1983. Entire towns built around a single mill woke up to find that mill shut down, its gates locked, its stacks cold. Homestead Works is the symbol of that fall. This was a plant that had once employed 15,000 workers and played a starring role in the birth of the modern labor movement. By 1986, it was dead. Shut down permanently. Today, if you visit the site, you don't find roaring furnaces. You find a shopping center, a few rusted relics left as decor, and a mall where a mill used to stand. The same story played out with Jones and Laughlin and other giants. Mills torn down, jobs gone, an entire industrial culture replaced by service work. And while the American mills were dying, the global game didn't pause. New competitors kept stepping up. European producers stayed efficient. Japanese companies like Nippon Steel grew into world-class giants. Eventually, China entered the scene and rewrote the rules entirely. Beijing didn't just want a steel sector, it wanted to dominate global steel. The Chinese government poured money into state-backed mills, modernized technologies, and an entire ecosystem of mining, shipping, and fabrication. Fast forward to 2025. China produces roughly 960 million tons of crude steel in a single year, even after a 4.4% drop that pushes output to its lowest level in 7 years. That's still more than half of all the steel made on planet Earth. China built so much capacity that global markets now swing on its decisions. When Beijing cuts production a little, prices move everywhere. When it exports more, mills in other countries feel the squeeze. That's what winning the metal war looks like. You don't just make enough for yourself, you make enough to shape the entire global market. Where's the United States in this picture? Still making steel, but nowhere near the top. American mills today produce a fraction of global output. And to feed its own appetite for buildings, bridges, cars, appliances, pipelines, and tools, the US leans heavily on imports. In 2025, the country brought in about 25.3 million net tons of steel, with finished steel imports around 18.7 million tons. Canada topped the charts as a supplier with several million tons, followed by Brazil and other players like Mexico and South Korea. Tariffs and trade policies, especially in the Trump era, did knock some volume down, but they didn't reset the fundamental dependence. Even with domestic output rising a few percent thanks to protections, imports still account for a meaningful chunk of the American steel story. Now, here's the twist of irony. One of the companies that once embodied American steel power, US Steel, is now in the process of being acquired by Nippon Steel, a Japanese firm. A corporation that at its peak helped define American industrial supremacy is being folded into a foreign conglomerate. The deal, worth nearly $15 billion, would turn US Steel into a subsidiary of a larger global player. The headquarters may stay in Pittsburgh, the name may remain on the letterhead, but symbolically, it marks something that would have been unthinkable in Carnegie's day. The teacher is now taking lessons from the student. But if this all stayed at the level of trade stats and corporate M&A, it would just be an economics lecture. The real story hits you every time you buy something made of metal. Because when your country stops making its own steel at scale, you don't just import metal. You import design decisions. You import someone else's cost cutting. You import the logic of global supply chains that are optimized for price first, durability second. Think about your refrigerator. If you've ever slammed the door on an old fridge from the 1970s or 80s, you know the feeling. Heavy, solid, like a bank vault. Now compare that to a lot of modern fridges. The metal feels thin. The sides flex if you press them. The handles feel like they might snap if you yank too hard. Part of that is design trend. Part of it is cost cutting. And part of it comes down to the entire supply chain. Cheap imported steel, thinner gauges, lower standards that still technically pass, but don't inspire confidence. Or consider a wrench. The old American-made hand tools from the steel era feel like heirlooms, dense, precise, the kind of thing you can hand to your grandkid. Now grab a bargain bin wrench made from whatever alloy was cheapest that quarter. Under stress, it bends, the jaws slip, it deforms instead of gripping. You're not just feeling bad luck, you're feeling the long tail of deindustrialization. When you outsource the making of core materials, you often end up importing weaker versions of the things those materials become. On a bigger scale, look at trucks, construction equipment, even parts of the national infrastructure. If the beams, bars, and plates are sourced from a global market that constantly pressures producers to shave cents off every ton, you get structures built to the lowest acceptable standard, not the highest possible one. The US still has some high-grade producers, especially in specialized applications, but the overall system is no longer built on the assumption that American steel is the backbone of everything. It's built on the assumption that steel is a commodity to be bought wherever it's cheapest this year. The result is a strange kind of hollowing out. Visually, you still see metal everywhere: bridges, railings, tools, cars. But underneath, the industrial muscle that used to live inside the country has thinned. The skills are rarer. The apprenticeship pipelines have dried up. The communities that once orbited around mills now orbit around logistics centers and service jobs. Steel built this country. Then this country, slowly and quietly, stopped building steel. And here's the thing: none of this was truly inevitable. Yes, the global economy changed. Yes, labor costs, environmental rules, and technology moved. But Japan, Europe, and later China faced those same realities and chose to invest aggressively in modernization. Basic oxygen furnaces, continuous casting, automated handling, new alloys, new product lines. The US steel giants, especially in those critical decades after World War II, often chose short-term comfort over long-term competitiveness. They milked old equipment instead of replacing it. They relied on scale instead of innovation. When the storm came, those choices showed. If you zoom back into Pittsburgh today, you can see that contrast written on the land. On one side of the river, shopping centers and apartment complexes where mills once stood. On the other, preserved brick offices and museum spaces talking about what used to be. Young people no longer grow up assuming they'll work in a mill. They grow up assuming they'll leave. The metal war wasn't just about tons and tariffs. It was about attention, ambition, and willingness to bet on the next furnace instead of clinging to the last one. So, what does this all mean for you? The person watching this on a glass screen held together by who knows what alloy. It means that every time you accept a flimsy tool, a hollow appliance, or a piece of infrastructure that looks tired after a few years, you're living with the consequences of those choices. It means that when politicians talk about bringing manufacturing back, they're not just talking about jobs, they're talking about the ability to control the quality of the literal skeleton of your society. China didn't win the metal war just by making more steel. It won by understanding that whoever controls the furnaces controls a huge piece of the future: construction, transport, energy, defense. The United States, for a long time, acted like it would always own that space by default. It doesn't anymore. The death of American steel wasn't a single day, a single policy, or a single villain. It was a slow erosion of an industrial culture that once believed in building the biggest, strongest, most durable things on Earth, and then started believing more in quarterly earnings than in blast furnaces. And if we don't understand that story, we're going to repeat it with other industries, other materials, other technologies. If this opened your eyes to what really happened to American steel, and why your fridge feels hollow and your wrench bends, hit subscribe, tap like, and share this with someone who still thinks we make everything here. And tell me in the comments, if you could bring one thing back, the jobs, the quality, or the independence, which would it be and why?